Hey everyone, I thought it'd been a long time since we had an overworked intro, so there we go. So we're back to doing a monster character. This here is based off of the Blob. I've referenced in the channel before that my oldest son is obsessed with slimes and blobs and a bunch of actual like other monsters as well, but slimes is like really his thing. And I was like, I wonder how I can get a slime character or a blob character into this lineup. Obviously there was the Blob movie and I was like, cool, that's my entry point, that's my reference, is just that it's that exists in this genre because of that movie and the remakes and stuff. But I then had to figure out like the angle for this version. When I came up with the idea of making it the form of a woman who is like really bubbly and like just kind of like voluminous, and really try to emphasize that slime aspect, I was like, oh, that's totally where it's at. So like almost instantly I just went right into the sketch. I had the image in my head and you could see there wasn't a whole lot of playing around. It just went right to it. And then I was like, all right, let's get some drippy slime stuff going and let's just get to painting as fast as we can. You could see there for a second I toyed with the idea of having bones floating in there, but I wanted it to be from another planet, not be like a human that got turned into a slime. So at first I tried doing lots of different colors, but ultimately went with a green slime version. I did really initially sort of imagine like orange, and then I was like, well, I did that jelly girl not that long ago, so maybe I'll also reference that, so I have a version that is exactly that palette, which you'll see it switch to in a minute. Once I had these three versions, I put them side by side and just kind of mulled it over for a while and eventually decided to go with the green slime version, also because I just felt like this palette really fit with the other characters in the palette, or the other characters in the lineup. There was a time where I was concerned about having some of the palettes overlap too much, but if there's too much color diversity amongst the character palettes, there can also be something where you're straying too far. And as we've seen in previous characters, I have tried to push those limits with a few key characters, and I feel like I found them. I feel like those characters were the sort of limit of that. And now with some of the other characters you're going to see in the remaining characters I'm going to do from this lineup, there is a return to that palette. So this character here has like a lot of the intense color palettes that fit some of those first, let's say, 4 or 5 characters, and then we have a couple more that are coming down the pike that are going to also have very extreme color palettes, so that we can sort of finish off this lineup, for now at least, with some really strong, brightly colored characters. So the story behind this character, because I know that that is something that people have really been digging listening to, is it's not that complex. The Blob as an entity came from space, and it very quickly saw an 80s aerobic video, and for whatever reason the Blob as a this thing from outer space like saw that and it resonated with it, and it was like, that's how I'm gonna represent myself. And I think the thing that's kind of funny about that is it knows it's not at all passing as a human. Like, it knows that it's green, it knows that it's slimy, you know, and all that, but like it just prefers it. So it's kind of like this funny notion of this like creature from another world coming here and then having an aesthetic preference that it just wants to emulate. And I think that that's kind of like a cool idea for this creature. So that is the premise, is that it looks like this because that is what it prefers to look like. But when it gets like kind of emotional, like either it's like in distress or it is going to attack or something like that, it will maintain its form only for as long as it truly like can, and then it gets to a point where it's just kind of going back to like full Blob mode, which is the alternate version that we're going to see in this video. We're going to talk about that as well. Now, even though the lineup are all, you know, characters that look like they could really handle themselves in a fight, except for maybe 1 or 2 of them, I'm not really thinking of this lineup as like pure combat characters. Like, I'm not thinking of them like they are the X-Men. I'm thinking more about like their stories and their background, and then maybe combat comes up for some of the characters. But the Blob, I did design combat. I did intend for combat in its design. So when you look at its knee pads and its wrist bracers, its bracelets, whatever you want to call them, those are metal. They are like colored, painted, something metal. And when the Blob starts kind of like going crazy and swinging all of its slimy tentacles around, those are these heavy metal objects, and in the case of the knee pads, the spiky metal objects that are in that slime. So as this big blobby slimy tentacle is hitting, it's not just the weight of that. If you also get clobbered by the either the bracer or the knee pad that's like in that slime, I mean, it'll just destroy you. So that's the idea, is that when it goes into full slime mode, it does that. Also, something that I should mention, something that I kind of pulled design-wise a little bit from from Pennywise, is Pennywise, at least in the new movies, I think it's in the older one too, but I just really liked the new ones. I thought the new ones were really cool, and it was kind of in the back of my mind, is there are those glowy little orbs that represent like that's the real entity or whatever. If you're like a hardcore It fan, don't like burn me to the ground for not totally knowing the point of those glowy things, but I think I get the point. And I was kind of thinking that about the eyes of this character, which is why when we get to the Blob version, the version where it is just full-on Blob, those are kind of repositioned in amongst, I wouldn't say it's like the soul of the Blob, but like those are these little like elements that are important, let's say, to the Blob as a character, as a sentient being. And so those are floating in there as well. We'll talk a little bit about that though more when we get to that. As for the costume design and stuff, the gauntlet, the glove wrist combos, certainly inspired by Chun-Li. There's some Chun-Li action happening there. As for the outfit, like just basically the swimsuit, I wanted to keep it really kind of skimpy because I wanted to show off how, like, all the blobby parts, like I wanted it to be just very slimy and that's the majority of what you're seeing is this big goo. That way I could try and push some of the transparency and the reflection and all that stuff. I did handle that very differently in this piece than I did in the Jelly Girl. So if you saw how I did it in that, I actually tried it that way with this character and hated the way it was looking, because I think to be honest, I think I wasn't in the right headspace to make it work. And so I decided instead that it was too noisy. So it was two problems. I think I wasn't in the right headspace to solve the noise problem in the way that I was doing it, because I knew I had all this stuff in the back of my mind about like layer limits and that it was going to be this giant pain in the ass eventually. So what I did was I instead chose how I was going to do the transparency myself. And what I mean is, instead of making it like everything has a transparency, so all of the see-through aspects are going to be kind of automatic, I instead just took control of that. Kind of like if somebody were going to do maybe like a lower budget 2D animation, you can't just make everything you want look like glass or something like that, or maybe completely see-through slime. So instead of, you use color to try and communicate that. So for instance, if you look at the thigh that's in the foreground, it overlaps the thigh that's in the background. It also overlaps like the lowest part of the bathing suit and things like that. So instead of making that thigh transparent and the other thigh transparent, and then they're automatically working together because of the nature of opacity, I instead take the shape of the thigh in the background and paint it as like a dark green blue over the flat for the thigh in the foreground. So I'm choosing to say, like, this is where the thigh would overlap, so I'm just going to paint that on top and then adjust its opacity. I think that'll be a little bit clearer when we actually get to that part of the piece. You'll see that what happens is I'll turn off sort of like all the lighting, all the shadows and lighting and things, and then just go in and start adding that. And I did that across the entire character. So when you see like how the hair behind its head, you can see it kind of showing through. That is just a layer of like purple that is on top of the face that's then had its opacity lowered so that it looks like it's showing through. The real positive of doing it this way too is that I'm controlling the noise. I'm making it so that the background, which is super dark, isn't taking over and really darkening the character and making the contrast like way higher, and so it becomes easier to read because I'm controlling all of these aspects. So the phase that we're on right now is the ambient occlusion pass, where I'm going through and making sure that everything gets like the shaping that I want. The light is being occluded properly, or at least as best as I can do. As I've said before, I consider this more of a form shadow pass because I'm not just trying to capture ambient occlusion. I'm doing a few things while I'm doing that, and it's just the way I work. The general schema of the shadows is there's going to be like the form shadow, the direct cast light, and then a bunch of supporting shadows. That's the easy way to explain it. I've explained it in detail more in the past, so I highly recommend, if you really want to see, like, if you want to understand all the facets of what I'm doing in these, you know, there's a bunch of videos before this one. Like, just take some time, maybe check them out, and you'll get some of the answers. Every video I try to cover either something different, or I try to be as holistic as possible, but no matter what, there will be gaps, and you can find those by going back through the other ones, the other videos. Now we're going to move into the direct shadow pass. This is where I'm trying to capture any of the shadow that it's casting on itself, any particular part of it. There are some choices that you have to make at certain points as to like what you're going to consider casting, especially since this isn't based off of a reference. But the premise is usually if it's like a completely different element, it'll likely cast onto the next thing. And if it's the same element, it's just about how defined and how separate are those pieces. For this, I tried to make sure too that to emphasize the little goopy bits, I tried to make sure that all of those were casting a shadow to try and push them forward a little bit. When I was in the middle of this part, I had all of the ideas for what the blob would do like in combat, and that the blob had like a true form, so to speak, but I didn't actually have any intention to actually paint that. And then at some point in the middle of this, I was like, man, but that's a really funny, or not funny, that's a really fun idea. I should do that. And then I started kind of like saying to myself, like, what is an easy way that I could do that, where I'm like, I don't know, trying to find an easy way out. Like, it's kind of like when you're doing an actual character and you want to have like a rendered version, but then you also want to explain stuff. You wouldn't necessarily render all the explanation supporting art. That might just be like lines and flats. I was like, maybe I can just do lines and flats. And then no, I just said like, I'm not gonna cheap out on it. Not to mention the fact that it was pretty easy compared to doing this version having like this female form and everything like that, and having all this anatomy and goopiness and jewelry and all of that. Having all of that happen is much more complex than having this sort of like big swoopy goopy blob version. So I was just like, okay, I can reuse some of the bits from the original one, and like, okay, I won't be lazy, I'll go ahead and do it. Something that's kind of just like a weird factoid that I always like to share is what I was watching. Weirdly enough, so my wife and I, we have been in this mood since the pandemic started, because I actually painted this character a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago even, and I've just kind of held on to it with all the other things going on. We've been in this mood where we've wanted to watch like sleazy sort of like 80s, 90s thriller type movies. So like we watched, like I've never seen Basic Instinct, and we're like, and my wife, who had seen it like 100 times, she, on like, I don't know, on TV in the middle of the day during the summer years ago, she was like, oh, you gotta watch it, it's such like it's like a time capsule. And I was like, okay, fine. So we watched it. Boy, did that live up to expectations. That was pretty amazing. But the reason why I'm highlighting all of this is because then we started moving down the list to Bound. I've always been a fan of the Wachowski sisters, and I had never seen that movie, and so I was like, okay, I really gotta actually see that movie. And she had brought it up, and I was like, okay, let's totally do this. And I have to admit, that movie was not what I expected it to be entirely. I feel like everyone who ever talked about that movie just talked about like the lesbian sex scenes, and nobody talked about like the whole rest of the movie basically. And then it's like this awesome like I don't know, to me it was like a play. It's like one set, like one scene. It had aspects of it that reminded me of like True Romance and some other movies, so I was really into it. I thought it was pretty good. Not the type of movie that I was just like gonna run out and be like, oh my god, have you seen? But I was pleasantly surprised by how good it was, especially seeing Christopher Maloney in that role with like all that hair and everything. What an awesome actor that guy is. But anyways, when I look at this, I see Bound. That's where I'm going with this little story, is that the last fifth of this and the entirety of the full Blob version was done while watching Bound. And the thing that's really funny is there's something about this character that kind of in the face reminds me of Jennifer Tilly, but it was completely designed, and that part was already done before I had started watching it. And while I was in the middle of painting, I was like, wow, that's so weird that this kind of looks like that. Okay, so you can see also on the legs and in the way the bathing suit like curves in the back there, you can see that those are just painted on top of the leg. And in fact, if you go back a little bit, you can see where they get painted on at full opacity and then lowered in opacity so they look transparent. So I guess the funny thing you could point out there is that it's not actually the leg that's transparent, it's the stuff that looks like it's behind the leg that is transparent. Really, when you're trying to capture a transparency like that, like if we're just talking in the simplest terms, what you're looking for is some degree of a merging of two different colors, right? So like if you've got something that's green and you've got something behind it that's orange, then which it doesn't matter which one of those is technically transparent, the overlap is going to be some midway point between those two colors. And so whether the leg is transparent and something's behind it, or the something behind it is transparent and then the leg is underneath that, it doesn't matter, it gets you the same effect. But those transparencies, to get them to work, have to happen in the flats folders. They can't happen like in the lighting, because the lighting still has to go over the top of all of that. So we've got some lighting happening. It got a little bit rushed, and you'll see some refining happening. I did kind of rush it and then went back and was like, okay, I gotta clean that up, because I was really excited to get to like all the bounce and reflection and all that kind of stuff. So you're gonna see that the longest part, I think, of this whole piece is going through and making sure all of the bounces are accurately represented. I actually did 2 sets of bounce light in this, or reflective light, however you want to think about it, because normally when I'm doing these pieces, it's like one thing of reflective light, it's just a lowered opacity layer, and then I do all of it on that layer. Technically that's not like the right way to do it, because different things have different levels of opacity, but different levels of reflectivity, but I generally handled that in the way that I actually applied the paint. So in this case though, I knew that everything that was slime was going to have to be shinier than everything that was matte. So there's two different layers of that going through. And then I do eventually put in a lot more little tricky things. For instance, all of these monster characters have that rim light that's caused by that orange light that's coming down behind them. In this case, I had to capture that, but then also I wanted to capture the transparency of the slime parts. So there's a hard rim light that hits the surface, and then there's an inner glow that's hitting the opposite interior of that surface to try and find some way to replicate that vibe. I'll point that out when we get to it, of course. So here now we've got the vignetting layers turned on, we've got all the lighting turned on, we've got all these bounces, and now I'm getting into the rim light. The rim light is, as always, painted with white. When I say as always, I mean for the monster ones, it's painted with white, and then we'll eventually select it once we're done painting it, and on a new layer we'll fill that more of like a bright yellow orange, and then we'll blur that to get the bloom off of it, set that, duplicate that and put it underneath, and then so that means we've got a blurred orange version of it underneath the rim light and on top of the rim light, and then the one that's on top we set to add, and that just puts a bunch of little, like a burst of saturated bloom on that, a hotness to it, and then we adjust its opacity. Here's where I'm putting in the interior bounce so that the rim light that's hitting it, it's like reflecting around within those orbs and other parts of the body when we get to that. And then you can see here I'm adding some extra shadowing and some extra support shadows. This is that time where I go in and I just add a little bit of softening to that to try and really get the form to round out. I really wanted to get to the rim light because I wanted to start seeing how all of that was going to play and then come back and add some things. So this one was not a very by the numbers monster piece. It was like trying to solve a bunch of things as I was going. Here we've got the rim light. The rim light is generally similar to whatever their main glow color is, and since the blob's main glow color are the eyes, then it's also yellow down below. Funny story, I put all of these characters into a lineup in Photoshop so that I could just see them all in one big grid, and I look back at Larry, the original monster, and it's so funny how that character has aspects of his application, I guess you could say, like the way the glow is, the way the things are, that I completely change later on and make like louder. Like the purple glow from the bottom in that one that matches his limbs being severed and broken is not nearly as intense as it is on like this character. So there's the final version. You can see that the main challenge here was trying to get the rim lights, the two rim lights, the main light, all of that kind of stuff done, plus capturing all of the reflectivity and bounce aroundiness of it. And this here is the blob in the form it likes to carry itself in. But now here let's jump into the blob in its more natural form. So you can see what I did was I turned off all the lights and I just went with flats. And I started painting and just kind of like, okay, I'll just figure out this form. It's a big blobby thing. It's gonna have the things that kind of look like the big hair pigtail kind of things that are going to be these blobby bits that are like inserted and like breaking apart inside there. My favorite part was that, trying to get like the swimsuit in there, but it's like blurred and stuff. The way I captured all of these transparencies was in the exact same way. The suit is just on top, and then I blur it and lower its opacity. Here I just stole the wristbands, the wristlets from the regular version, and then started like positioning them and repainting where I had to. Those things in the very ends of the slime there are the gloves, and then we've got the knee pads and the earrings are floating around in there, the things that tie up the hair, the jelly hair, the slime hair. And then you can see I tried to capture the embedding, the fact that the big eye globules are like embedded, and then the actual little glowy globules are also partially in there. And now I just start going through the exact same process I did with the humanoid version. So we've got all of these elements, and we're treating them exactly the same as before. We're doing the AO pass, the form shadow pass, we're doing lighting passes, we're doing all of the reflectivity, and then trying to maintain the two different reflective qualities of the stuff that isn't slime and the stuff that is slime. So yeah, it's pretty much the same process here. That's why I'm letting it go really fast. I even kept all of those layers around, and then I would just turn them on and clear them and then start working on them so that all of the settings were the same. That's what you keep seeing that looks like the humanoid form and then goes away for a second, is me turning on that layer and then using that layer to do all of the application. And then at the end there, I just threw in those extra globules. I realized I hadn't gotten that in there, so I just painted those in. No fancy layer effects or anything, just hand painted them in. Okay, and just for funsies, let's look at the original sketch and then the full version with all the rendering. We'll do a pan up of both versions. So thank you very much for checking this out. Thanks for all the support. If you aren't subscribed, please consider doing so, and please throw a like on the video so it helps with all those messy YouTube metrics. Thanks a lot. See you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.